So Mark Carney just killed Donald Trump's Greenland plan, not with tariffs, not with sanctions, not with diplomatic threats or economic counterpressure, or any of the tools that nations typically use when they want to block another country's strategic ambitions. He killed it with geography, because somebody in the White House apparently forgot to look at a map before launching the most ambitious Arctic strategy in American history. And on that map, directly, massively, unavoidably between the United States and Greenland sits Canada, a country that the United States has spent the past year systematically bullying, threatening, humiliating, and economically coercing. A country that now controls every route, every corridor, every airspace lane, and every waterway that connects the United States to its Arctic ambitions. And a country whose Prime Minister just announced a comprehensive Arctic sovereignty framework that formally, legally, and permanently closes every one of those routes to American use without explicit Canadian consent. Warren Buffett's response was characteristically blunt and devastating. "You can't build an Arctic strategy while alienating the country that controls the Arctic," Buffett said. "That's not a policy failure. That's a geography lesson that apparently nobody in Washington bothered to learn. And geography, unlike tariff rates and diplomatic positions, cannot be changed." What most people don't realize about Greenland is that it's not just an island. It's the strategic prize of the 21st century. Rare earth minerals that power every smartphone, every electric vehicle, and every advanced weapons system on Earth. Shipping routes that will redefine global trade as polar ice recedes. Military positioning that determines who controls the top of the world for the next 100 years. All of it genuinely strategic, all of it genuinely valuable, and all of it now requiring Canadian consent that Canada has just permanently denied. When you understand what's actually under Greenland's ice, why Trump wants it so desperately, and exactly how Carney just used a map to destroy the entire plan, you'll see why this is being called the most consequential Arctic development since the Cold War. Hit subscribe because the Arctic just became the most important theater on Earth. Now, let me explain what Trump's Greenland plan actually is, because it's not the joke most people think it is. When Trump first floated the idea of purchasing Greenland in 2019, the world laughed. Denmark's prime minister called it absurd. Late-night hosts made it a punchline for weeks. The general consensus was that this was another bizarre impulse from a president who sometimes seemed to confuse international relations with real estate transactions. Buy Greenland, sure, like buying a condo in the sky. But the laughter obscured something real. The strategic rationale behind the Greenland interest was never absurd. It was in fact one of the most strategically sound instincts of Trump's entire foreign policy, which made the diplomatic catastrophe of its execution all the more devastating. Greenland sits atop some of the largest undeveloped rare earth mineral deposits on the planet. Rare earths, the group of 17 metallic elements with names most people can't pronounce, like neodymium, dysprosium, and ytterbium, are the essential ingredients of modern technology. They're in every smartphone screen, every electric vehicle motor, every wind turbine generator, every precision-guided missile. Without rare earths, the modern economy stops functioning, and the modern military stops operating. And right now, China controls roughly 70% of global rare earth mining and nearly 90% of rare earth processing. That monopoly gives Beijing leverage over every advanced economy on Earth, and breaking it has been a stated strategic priority of the United States, the European Union, and every allied Western nation for over a decade. Greenland's deposits could break that monopoly. That's not absurd. That's genuinely critically important. Beyond the minerals, Arctic shipping routes. As polar ice recedes due to climate change, new sea lanes are opening across the top of the world that could cut transit times between Asia and Europe by weeks compared to the Suez Canal route. These routes pass near or through Greenlandic waters. Whoever controls the infrastructure, the ports, and the regulatory framework for Arctic shipping will control a significant share of global trade in the coming decades. And then there's the military dimension. Pittafik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base in northern Greenland, is America's northernmost military installation. It's a critical component of the U.S. missile defense system, a key node in Arctic surveillance and monitoring, and a strategic asset for projecting American power into the Arctic Ocean. The base has operated since the Cold War, and its importance has only grown as the Arctic has become more accessible and more contested. So, Trump's interest in Greenland was strategically rational. But his approach, and this is where the story turns from strategic ambition to strategic catastrophe, was diplomatically deranged. He moved from rhetoric to pressure. Direct economic threats against Denmark, a NATO ally, a fellow democracy, a country that has fought alongside the United States in every major conflict since World War II. Tariff threats, diplomatic cooling, public statements questioning Denmark's commitment to Western security because it wouldn't hand over control of its own sovereign territory. And then, according to diplomatic sources, The threat that crossed every line of alliance behavior, the private communication to Copenhagen that continued Danish resistance to American Greenland ambitions, would result in consequences for Denmark's position within NATO. He threatened to weaponize the Western military alliance itself to acquire an ally's territory. Let that settle for a moment. The leader of NATO threatened to punish a NATO member for refusing to surrender sovereign territory. And through all of this escalation, every deployment proposal, every diplomatic threat, every strategic document about rare earths and shipping routes and missile defense, not a single person in the White House appears to have asked the most basic geographic question imaginable. The question that any first-year geography student, any military cadet on day one, any person with a globe on their desk could have answered in 3 seconds: how do you get to Greenland from the United States? The answer: through Canada, over Canada, past Canada. And without Canada's cooperation, you don't get there at all. Pull up a map. I mean this literally. If you're watching this on a phone or a computer, open another tab and pull up a map of the Arctic. Look at where Greenland is. Now look at where the continental United States is. Now look at what sits between them. Canada. Not off to the side, not on the periphery. Directly, physically, geographically between them. The Canadian Arctic Archipelago, one of the largest island chains on Earth. Thousands of islands stretching across the top of North America, from the Alaskan border to Greenland, creates a geographic barrier between the United States and its Arctic ambitions that cannot be bypassed, flown over without permission, sailed around without cooperation, or wished away by anyone, regardless of how powerful they believe themselves to be. Canada has the longest Arctic coastline in the world, over 160,000 kilometers of Arctic shoreline. The Canadian Arctic Territory covers an area larger than the entire European Union, and directly through the middle of it runs the single most strategically important waterway in the Arctic, the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is the sea route connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through the Canadian Arctic Archipelago. For centuries it was impassable, choked with ice year-round, the graveyard of countless explorers who died trying to find a navigable path through. But as polar ice recedes, the passage is becoming increasingly navigable for longer periods each year. And as it opens, it becomes the key to everything in the Arctic, the key to shipping routes, to resource extraction logistics, to military deployment, and to strategic control of the waters that connect the world's 2 largest oceans across the top of the planet. Canada claims the Northwest Passage is internal Canadian waters, sovereign territory through which no foreign vessel has the right to pass without Canadian permission. The United States has historically contested this claim, arguing that the passage constitutes an international strait open to transit by all nations. But functionally, the passage weaves between Canadian islands, under the surveillance of Canadian military and Coast Guard assets, monitored by Canadian radar and satellite systems. Whatever the legal debate, the physical reality is unambiguous. The Northwest Passage runs through Canada, and Canada has the presence and capability to control it. And the geographic dependency doesn't end at the water. Any military or logistical operation connecting the continental United States to Greenland requires transiting Canadian airspace. American military aircraft cannot fly from any U.S. base to Pitifik Space Base in northern Greenland without passing over Canadian territory. There is no flight path that avoids it. Cargo flights carrying equipment and supplies. Resupply missions keeping the base operational through the brutal Arctic winter. Personnel rotations moving soldiers and technicians in and out. Surveillance and reconnaissance operations monitoring the Arctic Ocean. Every single one depends on Canadian air traffic control cooperation and Canadian governmental permission to use Canadian skies. In normal times, under normal alliance conditions, this is invisible, a bureaucratic formality processed automatically between NATO allies who trust each other. But these are not normal times. The alliance conditions between the US and Canada are no longer normal. And Carney just made Canadian airspace cooperation explicitly conditional on Canadian government approval for each and every military transit, reviewed on a case-by-case basis that Canada controls entirely. And then there is NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the joint U.S.-Canada military organization that has monitored all air and maritime approaches to the continent and provided early warning of missile threats since the height of the Cold War. NORAD is the invisible shield that makes North American defense function as an integrated system rather than 2 separate national militaries operating independently. And NORAD's Arctic surveillance infrastructure, the chain of radar stations, satellite communication links, underwater acoustic sensors, and monitoring systems that collectively make Pitifik Space Base operationally useful, is substantially located in the Canadian Arctic, Canadian territory, Canadian installations, maintained by Canadian personnel. Without NORAD cooperation, without the Canadian radar coverage and communication networks that feed into the integrated Arctic defense picture, Pituffik becomes a base that can see Greenland's interior, but cannot see what's approaching from any other direction. A military installation that has lost its peripheral vision, a base without its eyes and ears. And Canada has already announced a comprehensive review of NORAD participation, a review whose outcome is now directly linked to the state of the overall U.S.-Canada relationship, which is the worst it has been in the entire history of the alliance. And one final geographic detail that ties the entire picture together. Canada and Greenland are literal neighbors. They share an Arctic border. The tiny Hans Island, the subject of what was once called the friendliest territorial dispute in history, where Canadian and Danish military personnel would take turns visiting and leaving bottles of Canadian whiskey and Danish schnapps for the other side to find, was formally divided between Canada and Denmark in 2022. Canada and Greenland share waters. They share an ecosystem. They share fishing grounds and maritime search and rescue responsibilities, and an Arctic future that is intertwined by geography in ways that no policy decision can alter. The United States is not Greenland's neighbor. Canada is. And reaching Greenland from the United States means going through the neighbor first. So here is the synthesis that makes everything else in this story inevitable. Every element of Trump's Greenland plan, every military deployment, every rare earth extraction operation, every shipping route projection, every supply chain assumption requires either transiting Canadian territory, using Canadian-monitored airspace, passing through Canadian-claimed waters, or depending on Canadian integrated defense infrastructure. Every element, not some, every single one. Without Canadian cooperation, the Greenland plan isn't strategically difficult. It's physically impossible. And Donald Trump has spent the past year systematically destroying the one relationship his entire Arctic strategy depends on. That is the reality that Mark Carney just formalized. And the framework he announced is as comprehensive, as precise, and as strategically devastating as anything he has done since becoming Prime Minister. Carney delivered the announcement in a nationally televised address from Ottawa, the same calm, measured, surgically precise delivery that defined his economic transformation address months earlier. No anger, no raised voice, no theatrical defiance, just the quiet authority of a man who understands the facts on the ground better than anyone in the room and has designed a policy response that exploits those facts with maximum efficiency. The Arctic Sovereignty Framework has 4 pillars, and each one closes a door that Trump's Greenland plan requires to be open. The first pillar is the formal legislative assertion of Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage as internal Canadian waters. Not a diplomatic claim, not a position paper. Legislation passed by the Canadian Parliament with overwhelming bipartisan support, backed by new enforcement mechanisms, Canadian Coast Guard and Royal Canadian Navy vessels deployed to monitor, patrol, and control transit through the passage. Foreign military vessels are now prohibited from transiting the Northwest Passage without explicit advance case-by-case authorization from the Canadian government. Commercial vessels required to register with Canadian maritime authorities, comply with Canadian environmental regulations, and pay Canadian transit fees. The long-standing legal ambiguity about the passage's status, the debate between internal waters and international strait that the United States and Canada have quietly disagreed about for decades, has been resolved. Not through negotiation, through action. The second pillar is a massive expansion of Canadian Arctic military capability. New Arctic-capable naval vessels, ice-strengthened patrol ships designed to operate year-round in Arctic waters. Expanded surveillance and monitoring infrastructure across the entire Canadian Arctic archipelago. New radar installations, underwater sensor arrays, satellite communication terminals. Permanent military presence at key strategic choke points in the passage and across the Arctic coast, modernization of Arctic runways to support heavy military transport and fighter aircraft. Canada is no longer relying on the polite assumption that allies will respect its Arctic sovereignty out of diplomatic courtesy. It is building the physical military infrastructure to enforce that sovereignty against anyone who challenges it. The third pillar is a new Arctic cooperation framework with Denmark, Greenland, Norway, Iceland, Finland, Sweden, and the European Union. A coordinated approach to Arctic resource development, environmental protection, shipping route management, and strategic security among the nations that actually live in or near the Arctic. The framework includes specific provisions for supporting Greenland's economic development and autonomy through partnership rather than coercion, a direct, unmistakable counter to American pressure on Greenland. Carney is offering Greenland exactly what Trump demanded it accept from Washington, but without the threats, without the bullying, and without the requirement to surrender sovereignty. The notable absence from the framework, the United States, not formally excluded but functionally sidelined by an architecture that was designed to operate without American participation and without American approval. The fourth pillar designates all Canadian Arctic resources, oil, natural gas, minerals, rare earths, as strategic sovereign assets subject to new development frameworks that require Canadian government partnership, majority Canadian ownership, and alignment with Canadian strategic interests. Any nation seeking to develop resources in the Canadian Arctic will do so on Canadian terms with Canadian partners under Canadian law. And the nations invited to partner are the nations that have treated Canada with respect, not the nation that spent the past year trying to subordinate it. The message was unmistakable, and it was aimed directly at Washington. The Arctic is not a vacuum waiting to be filled by whoever shouts the loudest. It is sovereign territory belonging to the nations that inhabit it. And Canada, the largest Arctic nation by coastline, by territorial area, and by physical presence, will not allow its Arctic domain to be used as a corridor, a staging ground, or a supply route for another country's territorial ambitions without Canadian consent. The road to Greenland runs through Canada, and Canada just closed the road. Warren Buffett expanded on his initial reaction with an analysis that connected the geographic reality to the economic consequences with his usual devastating clarity. Let me explain what just happened in terms that anyone with a business background will understand immediately, Buffett said. The United States developed a strategic plan to access the most valuable undeveloped rare earth deposits in the world. The plan was sound in concept. The minerals are real. The strategic need is real. But the plan had one dependency, one critical requirement that every other element depended on. It required the cooperation of Canada, and instead of securing that cooperation, instead of treating Canada as the essential partner it obviously is, the United States spent the past year systematically destroying the relationship. It's like planning to build a factory and then burning down the only road that leads to it. The factory plans are brilliant, but you can't get to the factory. On the rare earth dimension specifically, the minerals are in Greenland. But the road to the minerals goes through Canada. The shipping routes pass through Canadian waters. The logistics depend on Canadian ports and Canadian infrastructure. The defense umbrella that makes the entire operation safe depends on Canadian radar and Canadian military cooperation. Every element of the supply chain between Greenland's deposits and the American market passes through Canadian-controlled territory. And Canada just established a legal and military framework that gives it absolute control over every element of that supply chain. The plan to access Greenland's rare earths is now entirely dependent on the permission of a country that has no reason to grant that permission and every reason to deny it. Buffett also noted the deeper irony that connects the Greenland debacle to the broader trade confrontation. An irony so devastating that it deserves to be examined in full because it reveals the entire self-defeating logic of the American approach. The entire purpose of the Greenland Plan was to reduce American dependency on China's rare earth monopoly, Buffett said. That's a worthy, legitimate, critically important strategic goal. Every serious economist and every serious defense analyst agrees that Chinese control over rare earth processing is a vulnerability that the Western world needs to address urgently. So I'm not criticizing the goal. The goal was sound. What I'm criticizing is the execution, because the execution didn't just fail, it achieved the exact opposite of what it was designed to achieve. Here's what actually happened. The aggressive approach to Greenland alienated Denmark and complicated access to Greenlandic minerals. But more importantly, the broader trade war alienated Canada, which has its own significant rare earth deposits, its own mining expertise, and its own processing capability. Canada is now developing those deposits under its own sovereignty framework and sharing them with European and Asian partners who treated Canada with respect. The Canadian rare earth supply that could have flowed to American manufacturers, the supply that would have directly reduced American dependency on China, is now being contractually committed to buyers in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. The attempt to acquire Greenland's minerals by bullying Denmark has resulted in Canada developing its own minerals and aligning them with everyone except the United States. The strategic goal was to reduce dependency on China. The actual result is that American dependency on China's rare earth monopoly has increased because the Canadian alternative that could have reduced it has been driven into alignment against American interests. That isn't ironic. That's catastrophic. And it's the single most consequential unforced error in American strategic planning since the end of the Cold War. Buffett connected it to Berkshire's own investment calculus. We have significant exposure to supply chains that depend on rare earth materials. The Arctic resource future matters to Berkshire directly. And I'll tell you something that may surprise you. Carney's framework, despite being designed in opposition to American interests, actually increases long-term investment stability in Arctic resources because it creates clear rules, it creates enforceable sovereignty, it creates a legal framework that investors can rely on. The previous situation, contested waters, ambiguous sovereignty claims, unpredictable American pressure campaigns, that was chaos. And chaos is poison for investment. Clarity is always better than chaos for investors, even when the clarity isn't what you wanted to hear. The Canadian framework tells the world exactly who controls the Arctic and exactly how business will be conducted there. Markets will respect that. Capital will flow to that. The question is whether any of that capital will be American, and right now the answer is probably not. The implications extend far beyond the Arctic, and they connect to every dimension of the US-Canada confrontation in ways that reveal the full scope of the strategic disaster. Trump's Greenland plan is not wounded or complicated or delayed. It is dead, killed not by a competing military power or an economic counterattack, but by the simple, permanent, unchangeable fact that Canada sits between the United States and everything it wants in the Arctic, and Canada has decided that the corridor is closed. Military logistics to Petofik that require Canadian airspace authorization will not receive that authorization under current conditions. Shipping routes through the Northwest Passage that require Canadian permission will not receive that permission. Resource extraction supply chains that depend on Canadian port infrastructure will not have access to that infrastructure. Diplomatic approaches to Greenland that could have been coordinated with Canada as an Arctic partner will now face a Canada that is actively offering Greenland an alternative to American pressure. The plan is dead, not strategically challenged, not politically complicated. Dead, killed by the map. And in its place, a fundamentally new Arctic power structure is emerging, one that was entirely unnecessary and entirely avoidable, but that is now becoming the permanent reality of Arctic geopolitics. Canada, with the Northwest Passage under formal sovereign control, with Arctic military capability expanding rapidly, with cooperative frameworks established with every significant Arctic and near-Arctic nation except the United States, is positioning itself not as a supporting player in the Arctic story, but as the dominant gatekeeper. Other nations access the commercially and strategically valuable Arctic through Canada, or they find an alternative route. And for the vast majority of the Arctic that matters, the shipping lanes, the resource deposits, the strategic waterways, there is no alternative route. This is not a temporary political maneuver that will expire when administrations change. It is a permanent structural transformation in who controls the top of the world. The legislation is passed, the military assets are being deployed, the cooperative agreements are signed, the infrastructure is under construction. None of this reverses on its own. Denmark and Greenland have responded to Carney's framework with undisguised, almost palpable relief. For months, Greenland's self-governing government had been trapped in an impossible position, caught between American pressure that came with promises of economic investment, but also with unmistakable threats about what would happen if cooperation wasn't forthcoming, and Greenland's own deep desire for greater autonomy and self-determination that American pressure only complicated. Carney's offer of Canadian partnership gives Greenland exactly what it has been seeking: economic development support, resource extraction expertise, infrastructure investment, strategic security cooperation, without requiring Greenland to surrender any dimension of its sovereignty to an aggressive external power. It's the deal that Greenland wanted to make with someone. And Canada, not the United States, is the one that offered it on terms Greenland could accept. NATO allies across Europe have expressed support for Canada's Arctic framework, and the reason is deeply personal to every smaller member of the alliance. The framework establishes a principle that countries like Denmark, Norway, Iceland, the Baltic states, and every other smaller NATO member cares about with existential intensity: that membership in a military alliance does not give the largest member the right to acquire or control other members' sovereign territory through economic coercion. If that principle isn't defended when it's tested, and it was tested with Greenland, then every small NATO member's sovereignty becomes conditional on the tolerance of the alliance's most powerful member. Carney's framework defends that principle, and in doing so it strengthens the alliance in ways that Washington's approach was actively undermining. And the global Arctic competition continues to evolve in directions that should alarm every strategist in Washington. Russia, which controls the other major Arctic coastline and has been aggressively expanding its Arctic military presence, building new bases, deploying new icebreakers, and asserting control over the northern sea route for over a decade, is watching American Arctic influence decline with the quiet satisfaction of a competitor who didn't have to do anything to gain an advantage. It was simply handed to them by American self-sabotage. China, which has declared itself a near-Arctic state despite possessing no Arctic territory whatsoever, is recalculating how Canada's framework affects its own ambitious plans for Arctic shipping and resource access. Beijing has been investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure, Arctic research, and Arctic diplomatic relationships for years. A weakened American position in the Arctic is an opportunity that China will exploit with characteristic patience and strategic discipline. The Arctic strategic landscape is being fundamentally, permanently redrawn. And the United States, which should be the dominant Arctic power alongside Canada and Russia by every measure of geography, military capability, economic strength, and alliance structure, has effectively sidelined itself from the Arctic's future, not because it was outcompeted, not because it was outspent or outfought or outmaneuvered by a rival, because it destroyed the relationship with the one country whose geographic cooperation its entire Arctic strategy required. The self-inflicted nature of this wound is what makes it so remarkable. America didn't lose the Arctic, it gave the Arctic away. There is a principle in strategic planning that is so basic, so elementary, so fundamental, that it is taught on the first day of every military academy, every geopolitics seminar, and every international relations course in the world. Before you make a plan, look at the map, understand the terrain, understand who controls the ground between your current position and your objective, identify the choke points, identify the dependencies. And if your plan requires the cooperation of a specific country, if you literally cannot execute a single element of your strategy without passing through their territory, their airspace, or their waters, then the absolute last thing you do, the single most self-defeating action you could possibly take, is to make that country your enemy. And yet here we are. Consider the full pattern of what the United States has done to the country whose cooperation it needs most. It weaponized the Gordie Howe Bridge, the $6 billion symbol of partnership, turning it into a trade choke point that damaged American communities as much as Canadian ones. It humiliated the Canadian delegation at a White House meeting that was supposed to repair the relationship, turning a 90-minute negotiation into a 26-minute debacle that destroyed trust. It provoked Canada into signing comprehensive trade deals with Europe and the Pacific Rim that eliminated the very dependency Trump's leverage was built on. And now it has launched an Arctic strategy that requires Canadian geographic cooperation, while having systematically destroyed every dimension of the Canadian relationship that cooperation depends on. Each action made the next one worse, each mistake compounded the one before it. The bridge weaponization made the White House meeting hostile. The meeting's failure accelerated the trade deals emboldened the Arctic sovereignty framework, and the Arctic framework closes the door on Greenland. It is not one strategic error. It is a cascading sequence of errors, each one flowing inevitably from the last, each one making the overall American position weaker, each one narrowing the options for recovery, until finally there are no options left. The United States needed Canada's cooperation for its Arctic strategy. It needed Canadian airspace, Canadian waters, Canadian defense infrastructure, Canadian Arctic expertise, and Canadian geographic consent. And instead of securing that cooperation through the partnership and mutual respect that Canada had willingly offered for 75 years, partnership that cost nothing, that required nothing more than basic decency and the acknowledgement that Canada is a sovereign equal, the administration chose to bully Canada on trade, humiliate Canada in diplomatic meetings, weaponize shared infrastructure, and threaten Canada's economy. And then, having done all of that, it launched an Arctic strategy that requires Canadian cooperation and expressed genuine surprise and outrage when that cooperation was denied. Mark Carney shut down Trump's Greenland plan with the most unchallengeable weapon in international relations, a map. Not a tariff, not a sanction, not a fleet of warships or a battery of missiles or a billion-dollar economic maneuver. A map. Because on that map, between the United States and everything it wants in the Arctic, the rare earth minerals that will define the technological future, the shipping routes that will reshape global trade, the military positioning that will determine who controls the top of the world, sits Canada, permanent, immovable, sovereign, and no longer willing to be treated as a corridor by a country that treats it as a subordinate. Buffett called it a geography lesson that Washington forgot to study. Denmark called it a relief. The Arctic nations called it the framework they've been waiting for. And the Greenland plan, the strategically rational, diplomatically catastrophic plan to control the top of the world, is now a document gathering dust in a filing cabinet somewhere in the West Wing, killed not by a rival power or an economic counterattack or a military confrontation, but by the simple, permanent, unchangeable fact that you cannot get to Greenland without going through Canada, and Canada has decided that you are not coming through, geography doesn't negotiate. Geography doesn't bluff. Geography doesn't care about rally speeches or poll numbers or executive orders or Truth Social posts written at 2 o'clock in the morning. Geography simply is. And in the Arctic, geography belongs to Canada.